In 1930, the greatest empire in history panicked over a skinny old man walking to the ocean. He simply intended to boil a pot of seawater. The British Crown was terrified of a sudden system crash. A handful of white crystals was about to expose the fundamental vulnerability of state power. Maintaining an exclusive grip on this specific mineral served as the absolute foundation of coercion. Lose the monopoly on salt, and you lose the state itself. To grasp the sheer absurdity of this fear, you have to examine the legislation that triggered it. The British Salt Act directly criminalized the laws of physics. It granted the colonial administration uncompromising control over production and sales across the entire Indian subcontinent. Even gathering natural deposits on your own private land constituted a severely punishable offense. A coastal villager could not scoop up mud left by the retreating tide to dry in the sun. Consequently, the tax on this basic human necessity guaranteed its artificial scarcity. It became exorbitantly expensive for the absolute poorest segments of the population. The administration effectively turned the sun and the ocean into contraband. Mohandas Gandhi recognized this massive conceptual flaw. How could one exploit this conceptual flaw without firing a single weapon? He chose this specific mineral because it bypassed all internal religious and caste divides. Every peasant, merchant, Hindu, and Muslim required it daily just to survive. Gandhi described the imperial regulations as a satanic injustice. The authorities had successfully taxed a biological necessity. They turned basic survival into a captive revenue stream. So, the Mahatma designed a campaign around the simplest crime imaginable. He wanted to show the world an empire willing to use lethal force over a puddle of water. He carefully pre-announced his intentions to ensure maximum visibility. On March 12th, the leader left his ashram in Sabarmati. He took 78 carefully selected companions with him. They were mostly men representing a wide array of castes, professions, and regions. He had even warned Viceroy Lord Irwin in writing beforehand. The crime was entirely public and meticulously planned. They marched for 24 days through the sweltering heat. The route covered roughly 240 miles of dusty roads. Their destination was the obscure coastal village of Dandi in Gujarat. With every passing mile, the procession swelled dramatically. Thousands of ordinary people fell into step behind the vanguard. A simple act of civil disobedience quickly grew into a massive logistical nightmare for the local police. At 6:30 in the morning, on April 6th, standing by the Arabian Sea, the leader bent down and picked up a clump of saline mud. That single, silent gesture publicly shattered colonial law. No weapons were drawn, no buildings were burned. The transgression consisted entirely of scooping up water and letting it evaporate. A completely mundane physical process was classified as a direct attack on the crown. Millions of Indians immediately started doing exactly the same thing. They began collecting, boiling, and selling the mineral in the streets and open markets. The British administration found itself trapped in a textbook dilemma action. They had two choices, and both were catastrophic. If authorities ignored the massive defiance, the legislation would become a joke. If they chose to enforce the law, the optics were disastrous. An empire claiming to bring civilization and order was suddenly arresting women for using cooking pots. Police and military units were dispatched across the subcontinent. Their orders were to beat unarmed protesters and stop the evaporation at any cost. Imagine the coastal towns during those volatile weeks. Heavily armed troops stomping out fires beneath makeshift cauldrons in the dirt. Local residents stubbornly fetching more buckets from the surf the moment the patrols moved on. It was a bizarre, slow-motion war of kettles and white powder. Some villagers treated the illegally harvested crystals as sacred relics. They brought the contraband to their local leaders as offerings. Within days, the widespread defiance broke the long-standing habit of compliance across the region. By May, the colonial crackdown reached staggering industrial proportions. Nearly 60,000 participants were thrown behind bars. The sweeps captured the movement's architect on May 5th, while the civil disobedience was still expanding. Mass arrests swept through remote villages and major cities alike. Photographs of brutal beatings over illegal evaporation circulated through the global press. The moral standing of London was crumbling under the weight of its own policing efforts. Later leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr., would study these very events. The campaign provided a clear blueprint for non-violent resistance. Why defend this specific law so fiercely? The financial yield from the salt tax was statistically small compared to the overall colonial budget. The campaign dragged on into early 1931. It expanded into widespread boycotts of British goods and aggressive tax strikes. The colonial jails were simply overflowing. Consequently, the logistical strain of warehousing prisoners forced London to the negotiating table. The resulting Gandhi-Irwin Pact on March 5th conceded a crucial point. It officially released political prisoners. More importantly, it allowed coastal residents to collect salt for their households. This massive event served as a targeted strike on the state's most primitive tool of submission. The panicked British reaction proved just how fragile that underlying mechanism really was. A government that loses its exclusive right to dispense survival loses its core authority. The imperial decrees of Emperor Wu of Han reveal a remarkably modern fiscal strategy. Imperial expansion required unprecedented capital. War is expensive. To fund his aggressive frontier campaigns, the emperor turned a daily biological necessity into an indirect, upfront tax. Dozens of iron foundries and salt workshops were forcefully reorganized under strict state control. Forced labor maintained the grinding quotas. The monopoly functioned as a comprehensive management system. The state realized it did not need to harass every single peasant in every remote province to collect copper coins. It simply choked the supply at its origin. However, this centralized control faced a geographical challenge. Coastal evaporation was vulnerable to local evasion. The administration needed extraction methods hidden from the casual gatherer. Centuries later in Sichuan, Chinese engineers pioneered early percussion drilling. They constructed massive derricks. Workers used heavy iron bits attached to braided bamboo cables to pound relentlessly through solid rock. The process took years for a single shaft. They tapped into deep, highly concentrated brine aquifers. This technological leap inadvertently sparked a secondary industry. The bamboo rigs frequently struck subterranean pockets of natural gas. Instead of abandoning the hazardous wells, Chinese engineers harnessed the gas. They channeled it through bamboo pipes to fuel the massive fires required for boiling the brine. A state monopoly rarely prioritizes the consumer. Official imperial salt was notoriously expensive. The quality was frequently abysmal, heavily cut with sand and impurities to stretch the state's profit margin. The poorest demographics simply could not afford the mandated rates. Survival dictated evasion. In regions like Lianghuai, official estimates eventually revealed a staggering administrative failure. Roughly 2/3 of all consumed salt bypassed the imperial ledger completely. The peasant families operating the boiling pans had a direct financial incentive to sell into the black market. The rigid state quotas simply did not cover their basic living costs, because moving heavy, cheap minerals across vast distances requires logistics. Smuggling could not remain an amateur endeavor. The imperial monopoly directly stimulated the rise of violent, highly organized secret societies. These mafia-like networks provided mutual aid, armed protection, and covert distribution lines. The administration was trapped in a fiscal loop. To meet rigid military funding quotas, bureaucrats continuously hiked official salt prices. Every single price hike pushed more ordinary citizens into the arms of the cartels. Even under immense government pressure, the black market thrived. Systemic friction flared up repeatedly centuries later in the West. The physical control of extraction sites was only one method of coercion. The French monarchy perfected the legal abstraction of the monopoly. They gave the world the Gabelle. The Gabelle fractured the domestic French market into a chaotic mosaic of different tax zones. Prices varied wildly from one province to the next. The true bureaucratic innovation was the sel de devoir. Stocking up on salt was no longer a consumer choice. The state calculated exactly how much salt an individual biologically required to live. You had to purchase that exact quota from government warehouses at heavily inflated rates. Refusing to buy your quota immediately designated you as a criminal. The staggering price discrepancies between neighboring French regions guaranteed geographic friction. This invisible economic pressure birthed the faux sauniers. These professional smugglers utilized hidden forest trails, rampant bribery, and deep local sympathies. For local smuggling, raw salt is easy to transport in small quantities and impossible to trace by origin. Protecting the Gabelle required severe escalation. The French crown created dedicated, armed salt police forces. Inspectors were granted sweeping authority to conduct warrantless searches. Armed men would routinely enter private pantries. They tasted the salt on the table to determine if it was legally purchased or smuggled. Here, daily life warped into a persistent state of suspicion. The government's relentless war against the faux sauniers built a sophisticated infrastructure of surveillance. Managing the flow of a simple commodity demanded unprecedented record-keeping. The administration had to map warehouses, issue transport licenses, and meticulously track regional intermediaries. Ironically, the bureaucratic skeleton outlived the mineral itself. The checkpoints, the licensing boards, and the internal registries were initially designed to track white crystals. These internal registries ultimately provided the administrative blueprint for modern domestic control. But police cordons and internal registries only manage fear. You cannot build a lasting empire on fear alone. You have to purchase loyalty. Look at your bank account at the end of the month. The modern digital transfer is historically tied to sweating legionnaires, worn leather, and heavily salted fish. The word salary hides a deeply physical origin. It descended directly from the Latin salarium. Etymological dictionaries explicitly define it as a Roman soldier's allowance. It was a regular stipend earmarked exclusively for the purchase of salt. There is an enduring debate about the exact mechanics of this payment. Popular history accounts often claim troops were handed physical salt sacks as wages. Linguists generally dispute this. They argue the term simply meant salt money. The distinction between physical crystals and stamped coins is largely irrelevant to the broader impact. The Roman administration achieved something unprecedented. They permanently fused the abstract concept of institutional compensation with a non-negotiable biological necessity. This made sodium chloride a major geopolitical pressure point. Rome constructed the Via Salaria. It translates literally to the Salt Road. It stretched from the coastal pans of the Adriatic straight into the heart of the capital. Beyond its commercial role, the Via Salaria functioned as a massive artery of state dependence. Controlling the logistics of that road meant controlling the legion's morale. To ensure the obedience of its armed forces, the administration simply guaranteed their continuous access to food preservation. Cut the supply line on the Via Salaria, and the stipends become suddenly worthless. Without it, spoiled rations would immediately trigger mass camp desertions. Provide the exact means to survive, and you own the recipient. The ongoing interplay forged a cultural archetype. It completely outlived the Roman Empire itself. By the Middle Ages, Salarium had generalized beyond military allowances. It evolved through Old French into Middle English. It came to denote civilian stipends and regular bureaucratic payments. The direct link to the salt itself faded. Did the concept of binding loyalty to a fixed pay schedule outlive the physical mineral? We still use the linguistic echoes today. When an employee is highly competent, we say they are worth their salt. The idiom implies something profound. A loyal person actually earns the life-preserving compound they receive. This idiom embeds the expectation of earning a life-preserving compound into our language. You are what you are paid in. The medium of payment historically encoded your social status and your duty to the institution. The chemical bridge linking sodium chloride and submission spans multiple continents. In India, the profound concept of loyalty is captured by the phrase namak halal. The literal translation is one who is true to his salt. Historically, acknowledging that you ate someone's salt acted as a binding verbal oath of absolute fidelity. I eat his salt, therefore my life belongs to his command. To betray an employer or a sovereign was to be namak haram. It meant being untrue to the salt. It was considered a severe moral failing and a betrayal of the fundamental biological pact. Science communicators often use these terms to illustrate a larger historical mechanism. How exactly do raw material conditions shape our most abstract vocabulary regarding duty and employment contracts? Taxes and regular stipends grew from the exact same crystalline root. The government figured out how to extract maximum wealth by monopolizing the coastal pans. Consequently, the government distributed institutional power by paying its enforcers with the revenue from those monopolized coastal pans. The tax-collecting apparatus and the salary-paying apparatus expanded in parallel. They were the inhale and exhale of a single imperial machine. You cannot easily separate the hand that takes the tax from the hand that distributes the allowance. Control over the salt supply directly translated into control over the military payroll. The empires eventually hit a wall. Running a physical monopoly on what keeps us alive is a logistical nightmare. Chinese dynasties understood this friction thousands of years ago. To keep the extraction out of the hands of ordinary peasants, imperial engineers developed deep drilling techniques. If the brine is buried hundreds of feet underground, you need heavy infrastructure to reach it. Infrastructure requires capital. The state easily controls capital. This sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus was built on the resulting monopoly from deep drilling techniques that kept extraction out of the hands of ordinary peasants. Europe faced a messier reality. Throughout the Middle Ages, salt occasionally functioned as a quasi-currency. Its extreme value and universal demand allowed it to store wealth. This turned every major salt deposit into a geopolitical target, triggering endless border conflicts over access and taxation. Guarding thousands of miles of coastline required maintaining legions of inspectors to raid cellars and weigh the contents of every pantry. The French Ancien Regime pushed this clunky mechanism to its absolute limit with the Gabelle. The fiscal authorities went far beyond taxing a spice. They invented the sel de devoir, a legal obligation for citizens to purchase a fixed quota of state-priced salt every single year. The directive carved artificial fiscal borders right inside the kingdom. Different regions faced wildly different prices. An entire bureaucratic ecosystem spawned just to monitor and police a white powder. The administrative cost grew so heavy that historians routinely cite the Gabelle as the prime example of a high-friction tax. It generated massive royal revenue while building an inequitable, arbitrary system that helped ignite a revolution. Its eventual abolition marked a foundational moment. The fiscal state finally began moving away from physical commodity monopolies toward universal, direct taxes. This historical separation explains the true nature of Gandhi's protest in colonial India. The British salt tax symbolized the intrusive, bureaucratic reach of the colonial state into everyday life. He chose this exact target because it exposed the moral fragility of the empire. The Salt March highlighted the absurdity of a modern, industrialized power acting like a medieval warlord, literally policing the act of collecting sea salt. The colonial administration maintained this physical monopoly well into the industrial era. According to tax history scholarship, early taxation in Kievan Rus was crude. It took the form of dan, a raw war tribute that slowly transformed into a regular levy. Authorities eventually established a formal unit of assessment called the dim, literally counting the smoking hearths and chimneys in a village to build a household-based tax base. When Ivan III formally abolished the Mongol tribute known as the Vikod, he introduced the first centralized direct and indirect taxes. By the time Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich systematized the state finances, the government leaned heavily on indirect excises. They aggressively squeezed the salt supply to fund the treasury. The immediate result was the Moscow Salt Riot of 1648. Urban populations burned down neighborhoods in direct resistance to this nascent bureaucratic centralization. Despite the explosive social potential, governments continued to rely on this mechanism. In 18th century Russia, about half of the state budget revenues came from direct taxes. The other half relied entirely on indirect excises and customs duties, with salt occupying a leading place right up until the revolution. Squeezing a survival resource always triggers a specific economic paradox. Fiscal authorities historically defended the salt tax because it was remarkably convenient to collect. Every human needs to consume sodium. Therefore, economists argued, the tax spreads evenly across the entire population. But is it truly impossible to evade biology? The reality works in reverse. A destitute laborer spends a massive percentage of their meager earnings on basic caloric survival. A wealthy merchant spends a fraction of a percent on the exact same physiological need. A flat tax on an inescapable survival need automatically transforms physiological equality into severe financial inequality. States eventually realized they were using the wrong tool. The physical crystal was obsolete. The true asset was the machinery of surveillance and collection that grew around it. In 1880, on the initiative of future finance minister Nikolai Bunge, the Russian government abolished the Salt Excise entirely. This strict infrastructure upgrade signaled a deliberate shift away from taxing basic necessities. By 1885, Russia introduced its first explicit taxes levied on the income of industrial enterprises. The government focused its revenue collection on abstract financial ledgers. The transition was rarely smooth. During the chaotic new economic policy of the 1920s, the early Soviet state panicked and reverted to the old ways. They reintroduced excises on basic goods ranging from salt to kerosene. Indirect taxes dominated again. The fiscal apparatus swelled into an extremely complex labyrinth containing up to 86 distinct payment types. That regression lasted less than a decade. The Soviet tax reform of 1930 to 1932 swept away the NEP-era excises. Authorities replaced the clumsy commodity taxes with two massive pillars for state enterprises: turnover tax and profit deductions. By the mid-1960s, the system emphasized abstract accounting levies like rent payments and charges on fixed assets. Therefore, replacing clumsy commodity taxes with turnover taxes and profit deductions created a proto-VAT evolution operating inside a planned economy. The state finally detached the revenue engine from the physical object. The culmination of this centuries-long evolution arrived with the 1991 law establishing the modern Russian tax system. The ancient Salt Excise fully dissolved into a complex fiscal state built on value-added taxes and income tracking. The global salt riots faded. The colonial monopolies shattered. Yet the grim inspector from the 18th century never actually disappeared. He simply laid down his musket, took off his brass-buttoned coat, and sat behind a monitor at your local revenue service.